There comes a moment in every life when the quiet question arises. Who am I, truly? Not the name you were given, nor the role you perform, but the self that watches in silence behind it all. You may have wandered far, wearing masks so long they began to feel like skin. Yet beneath the noise, something ancient and unshaken calls you chosen. This is not a title bestowed by the world, but a truth waiting to be remembered. And when you see it clearly, it will not comfort you, it will awaken you. You have been taught, from the earliest days, to answer to a name that was never truly yours. It was given in love, perhaps, or in hope, but still it was given placed upon you like a garment you did not choose. And as you grew, more layers were added. Expectations, labels, roles, definitions. You were told who you were by voices that spoke with certainty, though they themselves were uncertain. Be this, they said. Do not be that. And because you were young, and because belonging is a powerful hunger, you listened. You began to gather these fragments, stitching them together into something you called identity, though it was more a collection of borrowed reflections than a living truth. The E is something subtle, almost invisible, about this process. No one announces that you are being shaped into an imitation. It happens quietly, like dust settling on a mirror, until the reflection you see is no longer clear. You learn to measure yourself by standards that were never designed for your soul. You compare, you adjust, you perform. And over time, the performance becomes so convincing that even you forget it is a performance at all. You speak the words expected of you, feel the emotions that seem appropriate, pursue the paths that promise approval. Yet beneath it all, there is a faint uneasy sense that something essential has been misplaced. This borrowed identity is not entirely false, but neither is it entirely true. It is a construction, built from pieces of other people's thoughts, fears, and desires. It carries the weight of their unfinished stories, their limitations, their quiet disappointments. And because it was never formed from the core of your being, it requires constant effort to maintain. You must defend it, justify it, prove it again and again. You fear its collapse, not because it is precious, but because you do not yet know what would remain if it fell away. There is a peculiar exhaustion that comes from living this way. It is not the fatigue of hard work, but the deeper weariness of pretending. Even in moments of success, when the world affirms the identity you have constructed, there lingers a hollow note, as though the applause is meant for someone else. You may achieve what you were told to desire, and still feel strangely absent from your own life. This is the quiet cost of living as a reflection rather than a source. And yet, there are moments, small, easily overlooked, when the illusion falters. A thought arises that does not seem to belong to the script. A feeling surfaces that cannot be explained by the roles you play. A sudden clarity cuts through the noise, and for an instant, you glimpse something unborrowed, something that does not seek permission to exist. It is often dismissed, quickly covered over by habit and expectation, but it leaves behind a trace, like a footprint in fresh snow. What you have called yourself has been, in many ways, an echo. Not a lie, but not the origin either. An echo depends on something else to give it shape, to give it sound. And so long as you remain within the walls that produce it, you will continue to hear it and believe it is your own voice. But beyond those walls, there is a silence that is not empty. And in that silence, something far more real waits, not constructed, not assigned, not borrowed, but simply present, enduring beneath every name you have ever worn, and it is there. In that silence, that a different voice begins to make itself known. It does not arrive with force, nor does it compete with the clamor that surrounds you. In fact, it is often drowned out entirely by the noise you have grown accustomed to, the expectations of others. The endless comparisons, the restless demand to be seen and approved. This external noise has a peculiar authority. It speaks loudly, confidently, and often repeatedly, until it feels as though it must be true simply because it is so persistent. You hear it in the opinions that shape your decisions, in the fears that dictate your limits, in the subtle pressure to conform to what is already accepted. Yet the inner voice does not argue in the same way. It does not shout, nor does it attempt to prove itself through volume. It speaks with a quiet certainty, one that can easily be overlooked if you are not listening with intention. And because you have been trained to trust what is loud over what is true, you may dismiss it at first. You may mistake it for imagination, or wishful thinking, or even foolishness. After all, it rarely aligns with the expectations placed upon you. It does not always promise comfort, nor does it guarantee approval. Instead, it calls you toward something that feels both unfamiliar and strangely known, as though it were reminding you of a path you once understood but have since forgotten. The external noise, on the other hand, is deeply invested in maintaining the identity you have constructed. It thrives on repetition and reinforcement, feeding you messages that keep you within certain boundaries. It tells you who you should be, what you should want, how you should measure your worth. And because it is echoed by so many voices, family, society, culture gains a kind of collective weight that is difficult to resist. To question it feels almost like stepping out of line, like risking isolation or misunderstanding. And so, more often than not, you comply. You adjust your thoughts, your actions, even your desires, until they align with what is expected. But there is a cost to this alignment. Each time you ignore the inner voice, it does not disappear, but it grows quieter, more distant, as though it were retreating into a place where it can no longer be easily reached. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. For a voice that is constantly silenced cannot remain at the surface indefinitely. It withdraws, waiting for the moment when you are willing to listen again. And in its absence, the noise grows louder, filling the space it once occupied, until it seems as though it is the only voice that exists. There comes, however, a turning point, often subtle, sometimes sudden, when the noise no longer satisfies. It may be triggered by exhaustion, by disappointment, or by a quiet realization that something is missing despite all appearances of success or stability. In that moment, the noise begins to lose its authority, not because it has changed, but because you have begun to see it for what it is, an accumulation of influences, not a source of truth. And in that slight shift of awareness, the inner voice stirs again. At first, it may be faint, almost indistinguishable from your own thoughts, but there is a difference if you pay attention. It does not rush you, nor does it pressure you into becoming something quickly. It invites rather than demands. It suggests rather than insists. And most importantly, it resonates in a way that the noise never quite could. There is a sense of rightness to it, even when it leads you into uncertainty. Not the rightness of ease, but of alignment, of feeling that, despite the risk, you are moving closer to something real. To follow this voice requires a kind of courage that is not often celebrated. It is not the bold, visible courage of grand actions, but the quieter courage of listening when everything around you urges you not to. It means allowing space for silence, for reflection, for questioning what you have long accepted without thought. It means becoming willing to stand apart, even if only inwardly, from the patterns that once defined you. And in doing so, you begin to notice that the noise, while still present, no longer holds the same power over you. The two voices do not disappear entirely, nor do they fully reconcile. They continue to exist, often in tension, each offering a different version of who you might be. But as you learn to distinguish between them, to recognize the tone and origin, and of each, you begin to choose more consciously which one you will follow. And with each choice, the inner voice grows clearer, steadier, less easily drowned out. Not because it has become louder, but because you have become more attuned to its presence, more willing to trust what it reveals. Even when it leads you away from everything that once felt certain, and as that trust begins to take root, another realization emerges, one that is far less comforting than the first awakenings. To be chosen, as the quiet voice suggests, is not to be elevated above others in the way the world might define it. It is not a crown placed upon your head, nor a privilege that excuses you from struggle. Instead, it carries with it a weight, a responsibility that cannot be ignored once it is recognized. For to see more clearly is to be accountable for what you see, and to hear the truth within is to be unable to return, without consequence, to the safety of illusion. The world often dresses the idea of being chosen in garments of glory and ease. It imagines recognition, admiration, and a path made smooth by some unseen favor. But the reality is far quieter and far more demanding. To be chosen in this deeper sense is to be set apart not by status, but by awareness. And awareness has a way of separating you not always outwardly, but inwardly from the patterns that once felt natural. You begin to notice what others overlook, to question what others accept, to feel the weight of things that once passed you by without a second thought. This separation is not without cost. There is a loneliness that accompanies it, a sense that you are standing slightly outside the circle, even when you are surrounded by others. Conversations that once satisfied you may begin to feel shallow. Pursuits that once seemed meaningful may lose their appeal. Not because they are inherently empty, but because you have begun to see beyond them. And this seeing creates a distance that cannot easily be bridged by returning to what you once were. The door, once opened, does not close in the same way again. With this distance comes a choice, though it may not feel like one at first. You can attempt to ignore what you have seen, to silence the voice that calls you forward, and to slip back into the familiar patterns that once defined you. And for a time, this may even seem possible. You may laugh as you speak as you once did, move through the same routines with a practiced ease. But beneath it all, there will be a tension, a quiet resistance that reminds you that you are no longer fully aligned with what you are doing. The borrowed identity, once sufficient, now feels too narrow, too constrained to contain what you have begun to understand. Or you can accept the burden that comes with this awareness. Not as something imposed upon you, but as something that arises naturally from who you are becoming. This acceptance does not make the path easier. In many ways, it makes it more difficult, for it requires you to act in accordance with what you know, even when it is inconvenient, even when it sets you apart, even when it demands that you let go of what is comfortable and familiar. It asks you to live with a kind of integrity that is not always rewarded by the world, and sometimes quietly resisted by it. There is also a deeper responsibility, one that extends beyond your own life. To be chosen, in this sense, is not solely about personal transformation, but about what that transformation makes possible. When you begin to see clearly, you cannot help but notice the confusion, the struggle, the searching in others. And while you cannot carry their burdens for them, you are no longer entirely free to ignore them either. Your awareness becomes, in a subtle way, a light, not one that demands attention, but one that exists, quietly, for those who are ready to see it. This does not mean you must become a guide or a voice for others in any formal sense. The responsibility is not about performance or recognition. It is about presence, about the way you live, the choices you make, the honesty with which you engage the world. For there is a difference between speaking truth and embodying it, and it is the latter that carries a weight far greater than words alone. To live in alignment with what you have come to understand is, in itself, a form of influence, one that does not seek to persuade, but simply exists as an alternative to what is commonly accepted. And yet, even this can feel heavy at times. There will be moments when the burden of awareness seems too much, when the simplicity of ignorance appears almost desirable. You may wish briefly to return to a state where questions were fewer, where the path seemed clearer because it was already defined for you. You test such a return is never complete. Once you have seen, you cannot fully unsee. Once you have heard, you cannot entirely forget the sound. So the burden remains not as a punishment, but as a kind of calling. Not one that is announced or celebrated, but one that is felt, quietly, persistently, within. It is the weight of becoming, of stepping into something that cannot be reduced to a role or a title. And though it may at times feel isolating, it is also what gives depth to your existence, what transforms your life from something merely lived into something consciously chosen, shaped not by the noise that surrounds you, but by the truth that continues to unfold within. And it is within this unfolding that you begin to encounter a paradox that few are willing to embrace. That awakening does not arrive clothed in comfort, but often disguised as disruption. The very awareness that once felt like a quiet light now exposes what had long been hidden, and what is revealed is not always easy to accept. Doubt begins to surface not as an enemy, but as an unavoidable companion. You question what you once believed without hesitation. You re-examine choices, values, even the direction of your life. And in doing so, you step into a space where certainty no longer offers its familiar shelter. This discomfort is not a sign that you are lost, though it may feel precisely that way. It is, rather, an indication that something within you is shifting beyond its previous limits. For awakening is not the addition of something new, but the removal of what has obscured what was always there. And removal, by its nature, creates a sense of absence before it reveals clarity. You may feel as though the ground beneath you is less stable, as though the structures you once relied upon are no longer as solid as they appeared. What once gave you identity now feels questionable, and what once gave you direction now seems uncertain. Doubt, in this sense, serves a purpose that is often misunderstood. It does not exist merely to unsettle you, but to loosen your attachment to what is no longer true. It challenges the assumptions you have carried, not to leave you empty, but to make space for something more real. Yet this process is rarely gentle. There is a tension in letting go, a resistance that arises when familiar patterns begin to dissolve. You may find yourself clinging even briefly to LD ways of thinking or being, not because they still serve you, but because they are known. In these moments, it is easy to interpret discomfort as failure. The mind, accustomed to clarity and resolution, seeks to restore order as quickly as possible. It urges you to settle, to choose a new certainty, even if it is premature. But awakening does not follow such urgency. It unfolds at a pace that cannot be forced, and often requires you to remain in uncertainty longer than you would prefer. This lingering in the unknown is not without purpose. It refines your perception, deepens your awareness, and teaches you to exist without immediate answers. There is also a certain loneliness that accompanies this stage. As you question what once seemed obvious, you may find that others do not share your uncertainty. They continue within the patterns you are beginning to outgrow, and their confidence in those patterns can make your own doubts feel isolating. You may hesitate to express what you are experiencing, sensing that it cannot be easily explained or understood. And so, much of this awakening occurs inwardly, in quiet reflection, where the tension between what was and what is becoming eyes out without witness. Yet within this discomfort, there is a subtle transformation taking place. The very doubts that unsettle you are also sharpening your ability to discern. You begin to notice the difference between what feels imposed and what feels authentic, between what is merely familiar and what is genuinely true. This discernment does not arrive all at once, nor does it eliminate uncertainty entirely. But it begins to guide you, quietly, through the confusion, offering glimpses of clarity that were not accessible before. It is important to understand that awakening through discomfort does not mean that discomfort itself is the goal. It is not something to be sought for its own sake, nor something that defines the entirety of the journey. Rather, it is a necessary phase in which the old is questioned and the new has not yet fully formed. To resist it entirely is to remain where you are, but to become consumed by it is to lose sight of what it is leading you toward. And so, you learn, gradually, to remain within it without being overwhelmed by it. To allow the questions to exist without demanding immediate answers. To endure the uncertainty without rushing to ward false clarity. In doing so, you begin to develop a kind of steadiness that does not depend on external assurance. A quiet resilience that holds even when the path is not fully visible. For it is often in these moments of doubt, when the familiar has fallen away and the new has not yet taken shape, that the most significant shifts occur not in what you do, but in how you see. And once your perception has changed, even slightly, you cannot return to seeing the world in quite the same way again, and as this shift in perception deepens, you begin to recognize that what you are leaving behind is not merely a set of ideas, but entire versions of yourself that were built upon them. These false selves were not created without reason. They served a purpose, helped you navigate a world that often demands conformity before it allows understanding. They protected you, in their own limited way, from rejection, from uncertainty, from standing too far apart. But what once served as protection now begins to feel like confinement, and what once felt necessary now feels misaligned with the truth you are uncovering. Shedding these layers is not as simple as deciding to let them go. They are woven into your habits, your reactions, your ways of thinking and relating. You may find yourself returning to them without intention, slipping into familiar patterns even as you become aware of their inauthenticity. This is not failure, but evidence of how deeply they have taken root. To release them requires patience, and more importantly, honesty, the willingness to see them clearly without justifying their presence or condemning yourself for having carried them. There is also a subtle grief in this process, though it is rarely acknowledged. To let go of a false self is, in some sense, to let go of a version of your life. The roles you played, the expectations you fulfilled, the identity you maintained, all of these begin to loosen their hold. And even if they were never fully true, they were still familiar. They gave you a sense of place, however limited, and to release them can feel like stepping into a kind of emptiness. Not an absence of being, but an absence of definition. This emptiness can be unsettling. The mind, accustomed to labels and certainty, seeks to fill it quickly. It urges you to adopt a new identity, perhaps one that appears more aligned, more authentic. But is a risk in moving too quickly, in replacing one constructed self with another that is merely more appealing. True shedding requires that you remain, for a time, without a fixed sense of who you are. To resist the urge to define yourself prematurely, and instead allow something more genuine to emerge without force. As these false layers begin to fall away, you may notice a change in how you relate to the expectations of others. What once held significant weight begins to lose its influence, not because those expectations disappear, but because they no longer define you in the same way. You see them for what they are, expressions of others' perspectives, shaped by their own experiences and limitations. And while you may still consider them, you are no longer bound to them. There is a quiet shift from seeking approval to seeking alignment, from performing to simply being. This shift is not always visible to those around you. In fact, it may go largely unnoticed or even misunderstood. Others may continue to interact with you based on who you were, not recognizing who you are becoming. This can create moments of tension where the old expectations no longer fit, yet the new reality has not been fully seen. You may feel the pull to return to what is familiar, to ease the discomfort of misalignment. But each time you choose not to, each time you remain true to what you are discovering, the old layers weaken just a little more. There is a quiet strength that develops in this process, not the strength of assertion or force, but the strength of consistency. The willingness to remain in truth, even when it is less convenient, less understood, less rewarded. This strength does not seek recognition, nor does it require validation. It is sustained by something deeper, something that does not depend on how it is perceived from the outside. And as more of these false selves are released, something else begins to take their place, not as a constructed identity, but as a presence that feels both unfamiliar and deeply known. It does not need to be explained or defended. It does not shift according to circumstance in the same way the old identities did. It remains, steady and unforced, beneath whatever roles you may still choose to play. You begin to see that who you are is not something that can be fully captured in a definition. It is not limited to a title, a role, or are a set of characteristics. These may still exist, but they no longer contain you. They become expressions rather than boundaries. And in this, there is a quiet freedom, not the freedom to become anything at will, but the freedom to no longer pretend to be what you are not. And in this quiet freedom, something begins to emerge that does not demand attention, yet changes everything. It is not dramatic, nor does it announce itself with certainty or spectacle. In fact, it can be easily overlooked if one is still searching for something louder, something more obvious. But this is precisely its nature. A quiet power that does not rely on being seen in order to exist. It does not seek validation, nor does it measure itself against others. It simply is, and in that simplicity, it carries a depth that cannot be imitated. Self-recognition, in its truest form, is not the act of declaring who you are to the world, but the inward realization that no declaration is necessary. It is the moment when the need to explain yourself begins to fade, when the constant effort to define and defend your identity loses its urgency. Not because you have arrived at a perfect understanding, but because you have. I touched something within that does not require explanation. It is known not through words but through presence. There is a stillness in this recognition, a kind of settled awareness that does not fluctuate with circumstance. You may still move through the same world, engage in the same activities, speak with the same people, but something fundamental has shifted in how you experience it all. You are no longer searching in the same way, no longer trying to extract from each moment a confirmation of who you are. Instead, you begin to move from a place that is already anchored, already grounded in something that does not need to be proven. This quiet power does not manifest as control over others, nor as dominance in any outward sense. It is not concerned with influence in the conventional way. Rather, it expresses itself through clarity in thought, in action, in presence. There is less confusion, not because life has become simpler, but because you are no longer divided within yourself. The inner conflict that once pulled you in different directions begins to settle, replaced by a more unified sense of being. And yet, this does not mean that all questions disappear. You You may still encounter uncertainty, still face decisions that require thought and reflection. But the nature of these questions changes. They are no longer rooted in insecurity or the need for approval, but in a genuine desire to act in alignment with what you now recognize as true. There is a difference between searching for yourself and expressing yourself, and it is within this difference that the quiet power of self-recognition resides. Others may notice this shift, though they may not be able to name it. There is something in your presence that feels different, not louder, not more forceful, but more certain in a way that does not need to be asserted. You are less reactive, less entangled in the constant fluctuations of opinion and expectation. Where once you may have been easily swayed or unsettled, there is now a steadiness that remains, even when external conditions change. This steadiness is not rigid. It does not resist change, nor does it cling to fixed ideas. On the contrary, it allows for greater flexibility, because it is not threatened by it. When you are no longer defined by every passing thought or role, you are free to adapt without losing yourself. You can engage fully with the world, participate in its complexities, and yet remain connected to something that is not altered by them. There is also a certain humility that accompanies this recognition. Not the humility of diminishing yourself, but the understanding that what you have come to see is not something to be possessed or displayed. It is not a status, nor an achievement. It is simply a return to what was always present beneath the layers that once obscured it. And because of this, there is no need to elevate yourself above others, nor to convince them of what you have found. Each person, in their own time, must come to their own recognition. This quiet power, then, is not about becoming more in the eyes of the world, but about becoming less entangled in what the world expects you to be. It is a power that frees rather than binds, that clarifies rather than complicates. And though it may not always be visible, it is deeply felt in the way you move, the way you choose, the way you remain present even when nothing outwardly demands it. It is the kind of power that does not fade when attention shifts, because it was never dependent on attention to begin with. It does not rise and fall. With circumstance, because it is not rooted in circumstance. It remains quietly, steadily, as a reflection of something that no longer needs to be sought, only lived, and yet, even with this quiet steadiness taking root, there remains a path that cannot be walked in company, at least not at first. For there is a stage in this unfolding where solitude is not merely an occurrence, but a necessity. Not the kind of solitude that is forced upon you by circumstance, but the kind that emerges when you can no longer fully participate in what once felt natural. It is here that the journey turns inward in a more deliberate way, and where the presence you have begun to recognize is tested by the absence of familiar support. Walking alone, in this sense, does not always mean physical isolation. You may still be surrounded by people, still engaged in conversations and routines, yet feel a distinct separation within. It is the realization that much of what connects people is built upon shared assumptions, shared identities, shared ways of seeing the world. And as your perception changes, those shared foundations begin to shift. What once felt like belonging may now feel like participation with, though alignment, and this creates a quiet distance that is not easily explained. There is a temptation in these moments to return to what is familiar, to re-enter the patterns that once provided a sense of connection. The pull of belonging is strong, and it often disguises itself as necessity. You may question whether this inward path is worth the distance it creates, whether the clarity you are gaining is worth the subtle isolation that accompanies it. And because this stage offers little external reassurance, the doubt can feel more pronounced, more persistent. But this solitude serves a purpose that cannot be fulfilled in any other way. It removes the constant influence of external validation, the subtle shaping that occurs when you are always in relation to others' expectations. Without this influence, you are left more directly with yourself, not the constructed self you have already begun to shed, but the presence that remains beneath it. And in this direct encounter, something begins to stabilize, not because it is reinforced from the outside, but because it is sustained from within. There is a kind of refinement that takes place in this aloneness, without the need to form to explain or to adjust yourself to fit into a shared narrative. You begin to see more clearly what is truly yours and what is not. Your thoughts, your responses, your inclinations, these are no longer immediately shaped by the environment around you. They arise more naturally, more honestly, and in doing so, They reveal a consistency that was difficult to detect before. This does not mean the path is without difficulty. There are moments when the absence of external affirmation feels heavy, when the silence becomes uncomfortable, when the lack of shared understanding creates a sense of disconnection. You may feel as though you are moving without confirmation, without clear markers to indicate that you are on the right path. And this can be unsettling, especially if you have been accustomed to measuring your direction by the responses of others. Yet it is precisely this absence of confirmation that strengthens what is forming within you. For when you continue forward without the assurance of approval, your movement becomes less dependent on it. You begin to trust something quieter, less visible, but more stable. The inner voice you once struggled to hear now becomes more distinct, not because it has changed, but because there is less competing noise to obscure it. In time, this solitude no longer feels like separation, but like grounding. You are no longer alone in the way you once feared, because you are no longer divided within yourself. The presence you have come to recognize becomes a kind of companion not separate from you, but not entirely reducible to your thoughts or roles either. It remains steady, even when circumstances shift, even when external connections fluctuate. And when you do re-engage more fully with others, something is different. You are no longer seeking the same kind of validation, nor are you as easily shaped by the expectations that once influenced you. You can connect without losing yourself, participate without dissolving into the roles that once defined you. The solitude has done its work, not by removing you from the world entirely, but by preparing you to return to it without abandoning what you have discovered. For before you can walk truly with others, you must first learn to walk without them, not in rejection, but in clarity, not in isolation, but in alignment. And it is through this solitary passage that your saint will become your own, no longer guided by the need to belong at any cost, but by a quieter, steadier knowing that remains, even when no one else is there to confirm it. And from this steadiness, from this solitude that has refined rather than diminished you, there arises a final recognition, one that feels less like discovery and more like remembrance. It is not that you are becoming something entirely new, but that you are returning to something that existed before the world began to name you, shape you, and define you according to its own understanding. What you are stepping into now is not an achievement, but an uncovering, a quiet restoration of what was always present beneath every layer you have shed. Before there were expectations, before there were roles to fulfill or identities to uphold, there was simply a way of being that did not require justification. It did not seek approval, nor did it measure itself against anything outside of itself. It was whole, not because it had proven itself, but because it had not yet been divided by comparison or conditioned by fear. And though it may seem distant now, obscured by years of learning and adaptation, it has never truly been lost, only forgotten. To become who you were before the world named you is not to reject everything you have learned, nor to discard your experiences as though they held no value. It is to see them in their proper place, not as definitions, but as additions. They may shape how you express yourself, how you move through the world, how you understand others, but they no longer determine what you are at your core. There is a difference between being influenced and being defined, and it is within this distinction that your true identity begins to stand unobstructed. This return is not marked by a single moment, nor by a clear boundary between what was and what is. It unfolds gradually, often quietly, as you continue to live in alignment with what you have come to recognize. You may notice it in small ways, in the absence of the need to prove yourself, in the ease with which you make decisions that once felt complicated, in the quiet confidence that does not seek to be seen. These are not dramatic transformations, but subtle confirmations that something deeper has settled into place. There is also a sense of simplicity that emerges, though it is not the simplicity of ignorance, but of clarity. What once required effort to maintain now feels natural. You are no longer constructing yourself from moment to moment, no longer adjusting your identity to fit each situation. Instead, there is a continuity that remains, regardless of where you are or who you are with. You do not become different versions of yourself, you remain, and allow different aspects of yourself to be expressed without contradiction. This does not mean that all conflict disappears or that life becomes free of challenge. You will still encounter difficulty, still face moments that test your understanding, still move through circumstances that are uncertain or complex. but these no longer shake your foundation in the same way. For what you are now grounded in is not easily altered by external change. It does not depend on outcomes, nor is it threatened by them. There is in this a quiet kind of freedom, one that is often misunderstood. It is not the freedom to do whatever you please without consequence, nor the freedom to escape responsibility. It is the freedom of alignment, of no longer being divided against yourself. Your actions, your thoughts, your sense of being, they begin to move in the same direction. Section not perfectly, but with increasing consistency. And in that consistency, there is a peace that does not need to be pursued, because it is no longer separate from how you live. You may find, too, that the need to label yourself diminishes. Words that once felt important, titles, identities, categories, lose their urgency. Not because they are meaningless, but because they are no longer sufficient to contain what you are. You can still use them when necessary, still engage with the world on its terms, but inwardly, you are no longer confined by them. You know, in a way that does not require articulation, that what you are cannot be reduced to a name. And so, becoming who you were before the world named you is not a return to the past, but a realization in the present. It is the recognition that beneath everything that has been added, altered, or imposed, there remains something unchanged, something that has endured through every role, every identity, every stage of your life. And it is from this place that you now live, not as someone striving to become, but as someone who has remembered, quietly and completely, what was never truly lost.